The crystal chandeliers in our Beacon Hill brownstone always seemed to shine a little brighter whenever my brother, David, was holding court. We were at the annual family charity gala, an event where the air always smelled of expensive perfume and calculated exclusion, as usual. I was just the background noise, the invisible daughter standing on the periphery of my own life. David leaned in, swirling his scotch, his voice carrying just enough for the surrounding elite to hear. He smirked, looking at my modest dress, and called my biotech firm a cute little hobby, a harmless distraction from the real business of the family. I didn't flinch, I didn't argue, I didn't even raise my voice. I simply looked him in the eye and told him I sold that hobby this morning for $320 million. The room went clinical. My mother, Patricia, stood frozen until her wine glass slipped from her hand, shattering against the marble floor with a sound that punctuated the death of their leverage. That shatter was the final audit of my childhood. I wasn't the invisible daughter anymore, I was the most expensive mistake they had ever made. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. I didn't wait for the apologies. I knew they were coming, rehearsed and hollow. The moment the shock wore off and the social calculations began, I didn't need to hear my mother's frantic justifications or David's sudden, desperate attempts to pivot. I simply turned on my heel. The sound of my heels on the marble floor was a sharp, clinical rhythm, punctuating the death of their leverage. As I pushed through the heavy mahogany doors of the brownstone, the freezing Boston air didn't bite, it felt like the first deep breath I'd taken in a decade. I climbed into my car, the interior silent and sterile, a perfect environment for the audit I was about to perform. I pulled out my phone. This wasn't a moment for panic or a breakdown, it was a moment for a balance sheet. For most of my life, I had been the silent investor in their version of a family. I had been footing the bill for an elite existence that required my invisibility as a prerequisite for their comfort. I looked at the glowing screen and realized that our relationship hadn't been built on love. It had been a high-priced subscription service, and I was the only one paying the premium. Now, the service was being cancelled. First, I opened the management app for the primary credit line. This was the account that funded the charity galas, the five-star dinners, and my mother's relentless pursuit of social status. I had been the secret guarantor on this account for 3 years. A quiet safety net they never bothered to investigate because they assumed the money just appeared, like oxygen. With 3 taps, I deactivated every card associated with the line. $150,000 of monthly credit evaporated in a second. I didn't feel a sting of guilt, I felt the quiet satisfaction of a corrected decimal point. Next, I accessed the payroll portal for the Martha's Vineyard estate. To the world, it was the family's historic summer retreat. To me, it was a black hole of maintenance costs and staff salaries that I had been covering since my first patent went to market. I looked at the list of names: groundskeepers, private chefs, and a security team designed more for prestige than protection. They had overdrafted my compassion for too long. I initiated a total and immediate freeze on all disbursements. In less than an hour, those employees would receive automated notifications that their contracts were suspended. The estate would fall into a deep, neglected silence, a mirror of the quiet corner they'd kept me in since I was 8 years old. My phone began to vibrate against the leather console. It was a frantic, buzzing noise that sounded like desperation. My mother's name flashed first, followed by David's. I didn't answer, I didn't even look. I went back to my data. This wasn't a fit of rage. It was a clinical extraction of my resources from their toxic environment. They weren't horrified by their own cruelty, they were horrified that I had finally stopped playing the role they'd assigned me. As I pulled away from the curb, leaving the brownstone shrinking in my rearview mirror, I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon even a flicker of regret. There was only clarity. This wasn't a family falling apart, it was an accounting error being resolved. My mother's world was built on the shaky foundation of my compliance. She thought my silence was a resource she could mine forever. She was wrong. My silence was a vault, and I had just changed the code. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. As I drove toward my quiet laboratory in Cambridge, the neon lights of the city blurred into a series of data points. I didn't need a shoulder to cry on. I needed a clean workspace. I needed the blue light of my monitors and the sterile, predictable scent of isopropyl alcohol and silence. For 20 years, I had been a ghost in my own home, a background character in the epic of David's life. My mother, Patricia, had spent 2 decades curating his image as the visionary of the family, while my role was simply to be fine. I leaned my head against the cool glass of my office window, looking out over the Charles River. I remembered being 12 years old, watching David receive a brand new mountain bike that cost more than my father's monthly mortgage payment. I stood in the doorway, clutching a used biology textbook I'd bought with saved allowance, and my mother didn't even look up. She was too busy adjusting David's helmet, whispering that he was destined for greatness. When I showed her my perfect score on a statewide science exam, she patted my hand and said, "That's great, Abigail, you're always so self-sufficient, we never have to worry about you." It sounded like a compliment, but I realized early on that it was a dismissal. "You're fine" was code for, "We don't have to try for you." My father, Gregory, was an empty suit at a major bank, a man who traded on a name that was slowly losing its value. He was barely home, and when he was a silent observer to my mother's obsession with David. David was the investment, I was the overhead. As I sat at my desk, I began to analyze the pathology of my own childhood with the same precision I used for cellular sequences. This was the trap of cruel normalization. My family had spent years perfecting a dynamic where David was the golden child and I was the scapegoat. In high society Boston, the golden child is more than just a favorite. They are a vessel for the parents' unfulfilled egos. Patricia needed David to be a visionary crypto investor because her own identity was tied to the prestige of being a mother to a genius. But for a golden child to shine that brightly, there must be a scapegoat. Someone has to be the contrast. Someone has to be small so the other can feel towering. I thought back to the day David's visionary crypto fund first started to bleed money. My mother didn't panic, she didn't question him. Instead, she bought him a brand new silver Porsche as a confidence builder. She told me I should be happy for him because his success was family success. At the same time, I was working 80-hour weeks in a windowless lab, surviving on $3 protein bars and 4 hours of sleep, when I asked for a small bridge loan to cover my first patent filing fees. She sighed and told me I was being unrealistic. She told me biotech was a fringe hobby, and that I should focus on a more traditional path. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that her hobbyist daughter was becoming the silent architect of their survival. 3 years ago, I found a folder on my father's desk. Gregory had mismanaged his private accounts so badly that the Beacon Hill brownstone was months away from a quiet, humiliating foreclosure. The bank was ready to move. The name Gregory traded on was worth zero. I didn't cry. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask why. I went back to my lab and finalized a licensing deal for a protein folding algorithm. I took that first check, $850,000, and I didn't buy a Porsche. I contacted a third-party holding company and bought the debt on our family home. I became my father's landlord without him ever knowing his roof was provided by the daughter he barely noticed at dinner. I sat in the clinical glow of my Cambridge laboratory, the dual monitors casting a sharp blue light over the surfaces that had become my only real home. My phone did not just ring, it screamed with the frequency of a failing cardiac monitor. For the last 4 hours, I had maintained a rhythmic, cold ritual. I would look at the screen, see a name that used to signify authority, and swipe left into the void. This was not a breakdown, it was a scheduled extraction of toxic data. Anger, I realized, was most lethal when it became a quiet accounting of facts. The first voicemail from my mother, Patricia, arrived 48 minutes after I left the gala. Her voice was a strained mixture of social panic and sudden, unearned entitlement. She did not ask how I had managed to build a $320 million empire in the dark. She did not apologize for the 27 years of background noise. Instead, she spoke in terms of a debt collection. She told me that she and my father were beyond shocked at my secrecy, but that this was ultimately a family victory. Then came the demand. She said that David's crypto fund was facing a temporary liquidity crisis and that it was only fair for me to provide a $50 million capital infusion immediately to keep the family legacy intact. I stared at the transcript on my screen. To Patricia, my success was just an unallocated resource for her golden son's black hole of a business. It was a business transaction where I was expected to pay the premium for a relationship that had expired years ago. I deleted the message. I felt no hesitation, only the quiet satisfaction of a corrected decimal point in a long-overdue audit. David's escalation was more aggressive. When the phone calls didn't work, he pivoted to professional sabotage. He began a calculated smear campaign on LinkedIn and Instagram, posting cryptic messages about the mental health toll of the biotech industry. He implied to our social circle that I was succumbing to the pressure and that my mental stability was a worrying indicator for the future of the company I had just sold. As I watched his posts appear, I didn't panic. I watched them like a scientist observing the predictable spasms of a dying organism. The question I kept seeing in the comments, and the one that echoed in the back of my own mind, was simple: why now? Why did I wait 20 years to flip the table? Why did I continue to pay their bills and endure their dismissals when I had the power to leave 1,000 times over? The answer was the invisible chains of the survivor. For most of my life, I had lived in a prison without bars. It was a psychological architecture built on learned helplessness. When you are told from the age of 8 that you are the overhead and your brother is the investment, you start to signal your own cells to stop trying. I stayed because I was trapped in a cycle of seeking validation from the very people who were committed to never giving it. I thought that if I was useful enough, if I was the silent guarantor who saved the house, they would finally see the person beneath the productivity. I was waiting for a signal that was never going to come. That realization, that my compassion was a luxury they had overdrawn, was the moment the chain snapped. I realized I wasn't waiting for them to see me. I was waiting for me to stop looking at them. My endurance wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a survival strategy that had finally reached its conclusion. I was a scientist who had finished the experiment, the data was in, the results were conclusive, and the subject, my family, had failed every metric of human decency. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I went back to my laptop, my fingers moving with a precision that David could never emulate. I wasn't just deleting their messages anymore, I was preparing to file the final audit. Inside my lab, the screens glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and a quiet retribution that was just beginning to scale. Julia sat across from me in my private office, her presence a sharp contrast to the chaotic emotional noise of Beacon Hill. She didn't offer a platitude or a "sorry about your family." She simply opened a leather-bound portfolio and slid a series of documents toward me. This was the professional escalation I had been waiting for. I hadn't hired Julia to reconcile, I hired her to perform a forensic autopsy on 20 years of betrayal. In the world of high-stakes biotech, data is everything. In the world of toxic families, evidence is the only thing that matters. "The audit is complete," she said, her voice as flat and clinical as a dial tone. I looked at the first page, my eyes scanning the rows of numbers and dates. I didn't feel a surge of sadness. I didn't feel the heat of a breakdown. I felt the ice-cold clarity of a scientist who had just verified a lethal pathogen. This wasn't a family dynamic. It was a criminal enterprise operating under the cover of a historic name. Julia pointed to a signature on a high-interest loan application dated 4 months ago. It was a $2 million personal line of credit, secured using my private shares in the biotech firm as collateral. The ink was a deep, authoritative blue. The signature looked identical to mine. To any loan officer at a major bank, it was Abigail, but as I looked at the pressure points in the loops of the letters, I saw the invisible tremor of David's cowardice. He had forged my signature to stop the bleeding in his failing crypto fund. He hadn't just ignored me, he had tried to harvest my organs, professionally speaking, to keep his own pulse going. "There's more," Julia added, her expression hardening as she turned the page. She handed me a log of encrypted emails and digital timestamps retrieved from the family brownstone central server. I had been the one who secretly installed and maintained that hardware years ago. And now my own creation was providing the testimony my mother thought she'd buried. Patricia hadn't just been gushing over David's hypothetical ventures while I ate alone, she had been actively pitching my early stage research to our direct competitors. She was attempting to conduct corporate espionage against her own daughter, trying to sell my patent drafts to the highest bidder before my acquisition could even reach the table. I leaned back in my chair, the silence of the room amplified by the soft hum of the air filtration system. I didn't need a hug, I didn't need an apology, I needed a balance sheet, and I finally had it in front of me. I had been the silent investor in their version of a family, but now I realized the business was fraudulent from the start. Love wasn't a contract they were capable of honoring, it was a subscription they had been charging to my account while they tried to bankrupt me in the dark. This discovery was the kill shot. It removed the last possibility of redemption. They weren't just ungrateful or biased, they were criminals hiding behind a marble fireplace. I looked at Julia and told her to initiate the full legal protocol. No settlements, no private conversations. I wanted the forensic truth to be part of the public record. This wasn't revenge, it was a total liquidation of a toxic asset. The Beacon Hill brownstone didn't look like a home anymore. As I stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the historic brick and the ivy I had spent my teenage years trying to keep alive, I realized it was just a distressed asset. It was a line item on a balance sheet I was about to close. The architecture of my childhood was built on cold stone and even colder silence, and as I looked at the flickering lights in the drawing room, I felt the finality of a completed audit. I didn't enter with a key, I entered with authority. 2 private security officers followed me inside, their footsteps a heavy, rhythmic warning on the mahogany floors that echoed through the empty hall. Julia was at my side, her leather portfolio containing the final forensic audit of a 20-year betrayal. We walked into the drawing room, The air was thick with the scent of expensive scotch and the unearned confidence of people who thought they had hit a social lottery. Patricia was already pointing at the crown molding, discussing a six-figure kitchen remodel with an interior designer who looked as hollow as the promises my mother had made me for 2 decades. David was sprawled on the silk sofa, swirling a drink, likely calculating exactly how he would spend the $50 million he thought I was going to hand him to bail out his ego. Gregory sat in his usual corner, a silent observer to the theft of my life. They looked up, and for a second, the room went clinical. Patricia's face shifted into that performative mask of motherly relief she wore for public consumption. She stood up, smoothing her skirt with manicured hands that had never held a lab tool. "Abigail, thank God you are here," she said, her voice dripping with a forced sweetness that made my skin crawl. "Merry Christmas, darling," she added. As if the holiday were a voucher she could redeem for my compliance, she gestured to a pile of perfectly wrapped boxes under a smaller, secondary tree in the drawing room. Gifts bought by assistants, for a daughter she didn't know. "We were just discussing the new tax structures for your capital gains. We need to move quickly to protect the family estate and ensure David has the liquidity he needs for his venture." I didn't sit down. I didn't accept the glass of wine she offered. I didn't even acknowledge the designer. I simply looked at the mahogany desk where David's athletic trophies had always sat like religious icons, while my early patent drafts had been relegated to a cardboard box in the basement. "There is no family estate, Patricia," I said. My voice was a flat, clinical dial tone, "and there certainly isn't going to be a remodel." The designer looked at the tension in the room and excused herself, sensing the atmospheric pressure of a looming explosion. Patricia's mask didn't drop immediately, she just blinked, her brows furrowing in confusion. Julia stepped forward and placed a heavy manila folder on the marble coffee table. It landed with a sound that punctuated the end of their era, a sharp, final thud of paper against stone. David reached for it, his smirk still partially intact. He expected a check. He expected a lifeline. He expected the scapegoat to provide the harvest as she always had. Instead, he found the formal notice of foreclosure and an immediate eviction order. I watched his eyes scan the bold text at the top, his jaw going slack as he reached the section detailing the forensic evidence of his $2 million forgery. I watched his hands begin to shake, the glass of scotch vibrating against the table. Patricia leaned over his shoulder, her eyes darting across the digits of their ruin, her lips moving as she tried to count the commas in the debt I now held. "I didn't just sell my company for $320 million this morning," I explained, my tone as unemotional as a balance sheet. "I used the first $850,000 I ever made 3 years ago to buy your mortgage from the bank. I have been your landlord for over 1,000 days. I was the silent investor in your survival while you called me background noise. I paid the property taxes you ignored while you gushed over David's fake Porsche. I provided the roof over your heads while you tried to sell my early-stage research to my direct competitors. I was the one footing the bill for the very gala where you mocked me." The silence that followed was suffocating, a vacuum of power that left them gasping. Patricia fell back into her silk armchair, her voice a shrill, desperate whisper that lost all its Boston polish. "Abigail, you can't do this. We're your parents. We gave you everything. We gave you this name." David dropped the folder, the papers fluttering to the floor like autumn leaves. He looked at the security guards and then at me, his face white as a sheet. "Abby, please, if this goes to the district attorney, I'm finished. I'll go to prison. Just a small loan, to keep it in the family. We can fix this. We can go back to how it was." I looked at them, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, not even the heat of revenge, just the quiet, icy satisfaction of a balanced account. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for the last time, and the interest was finally due. I walked to the fireplace and picked up the small Hobbyist of the Year award Gregory had given me as a joke when I launched my first lab in our garage. I looked at the cheap plastic gold and the condescending inscription. I dropped it into the flames and watched the plastic curl and turn to black smoke. "I already gave you my childhood, David," I said, my voice echoing in the cold marble hall. "I have nothing left for you, not a dollar, not a minute, not a single thought. You have exactly 1 hour to pack whatever you can carry. Anything left behind after 60 minutes becomes part of the liquidated assets of the foreclosure." I turned on my heel and walked toward the door, the sound of my steps a final, decisive rhythm. Behind me, I heard Patricia start to sob and David begin to beg, but I didn't turn back. I had spent 27 years waiting for them to see me, but I realized as I stepped out into the Boston night that the only person who needed to see me was the woman I had become. The Cambridge Protocol was complete, the balance was zero. The Beacon Hill brownstone sold at auction 6 weeks later for $4,800,000. I didn't attend the sale. I didn't need to be there to witness the physical liquidation of my childhood. In the world of high-stakes accounting, you don't mourn a toxic asset. You write it off and move the capital to a more productive venture, to the city of Boston. It was a historic landmark changing hands. To me, it was just the final entry in a ledger that had been imbalanced for 27 years. The brick and mortar were gone, and with them, the last echoes of the background noise I had been forced to live in. I sat in my new lab in Cambridge, watching the sunrise hit the glass of the MIT campus across the river. The silence was absolute, filtered through a state-of-the-art ventilation system that cost more than my mother's entire jewelry collection. I looked at the digital display on my wall, which now showed the launch of the Abigail Biotech Foundation for Unsupported Youth. I had seeded it with $50 million, exactly the amount Patricia had demanded to bail out David's ego, but this money wasn't going to fund fake Porsches or crypto gambling. It was for the background noise of children, the ones who were told they were just fine and didn't need investment. It was for the researchers working in garages who had been overdrafted by their own bloodlines. My phone buzzed one last time. It was a message from an unrecognized number, but the syntax was pure Patricia. It spoke of the sacredness of family blood and the cruelty of a daughter who could watch her own parents move into a 2-bedroom rental in a suburb they used to mock. I didn't feel a sting of regret. I didn't even feel the heat of anger. This was the final step of the Cambridge Protocol, the biology of total sovereignty. I realized then that letting go of a toxic bloodline isn't an act of revenge, it's an act of self-preservation. Some believe that blood is a permanent contract, but I had learned that it is merely a biological data point. If the sequence is defective and the system is parasitic, the only clinical solution is to cut the line and begin a new culture. I deromanticized our history with the precision of an autopsy. Love had been a high-priced subscription I was no longer willing to fund. My mother hadn't lost a daughter, she had lost a silent investor who stopped accepting her fraudulent terms. David hadn't been betrayed. He had been audited by the very person he thought was too small to count. I looked at the sunrise and realized that, for the first time in my life, my oxygen was my own. I wasn't breathing for their approval anymore. I was breathing for my own discovery. I opened my old childhood spreadsheet, the one where I had tracked every slight and every dollar for a decade. I stared at the numbers for a long moment, then I hit delete. The screen blinked, the data disappeared, and the balance was finally zero. That night, I slept through until morning. No guilt, no noise, just the quiet, clinical peace of a woman who had built her own empire from the ashes of a house that never deserved her. If you found Abigail's journey inspiring, hit the share button and let us know in the comments. Have you ever had to choose yourself over a toxic family? Your story could be the spark someone else needs to hear.